silhouettes at the opening of this video were extracted from an actual photograph of the Ramsay family from the National Gallery in Scotland. The name Miss Ramsay will ring a bell for some Baha'is. She was a Christian missionary active in Palestine in the last decade of the 19th century and the opening decade of the 20th century. She worked primarily in Akka and Haifa, and she figures prominently in a couple of humorous anecdotes involving Abdu'l-Bahá. We'll get into the anecdotes later, but beyond them, what do we really know about Miss Ramsay? When I began searching, it didn't look promising, however. That changed when I discovered an online edition of the 1890 Church Missionary Gleaner. Therein, I discovered that Miss Ramsay was actually Miss Wardlaw Ramsay, with the initials E.C. With the name E.C. Wardlaw Ramsay, I found an entry from a peerage genealogy website for an Elizabeth Caroline Wardlaw Ramsay. Not only did it match the E.C. initials, but there was also a note confirming that she had been a missionary with the Christian Missionary Society stationed in Akka. It also supplied her date of birth, which was slightly off, and her date of death, which turned out to be highly inaccurate, but more on that a bit later. In addition to the peerage website, I also happened upon a treasure trove of a website dedicated to the Ramsay family, in which they share stories through photos and personal letters. You'll find a link in the description box, and it's definitely worth checking out. Indeed, much of what you'll hear in this video about the Ramsay family was gleaned from that website. Miss Ramsay's maternal grandfather was a man of note. His name was George Hay. He was the 8th Marquis of Tweeddale, and he achieved the rank of Field Marshal. This actually places him above generals. This is similar to the status of a 5-star general. He also held various subsidiary titles, which I must admit mean very little to me, but for the British among us, he held titles such as the Earl of Tweeddale, Earl of Gifford, Viscount of Walden, Lord Hay of Yester, and Baron Tweeddale. This is the Yester House, which was the family estate. As I dug deeper, the whole thing seemed to have a bit of a Downton Abbey vibe. Wealth, drama, tragedy. Her paternal grandfather was also a man of means. His considerable estate consisted of land holdings with large woods, coal mines, brickworks, glassworks, and salt pans. His wife was Lady Anne Lindsay. She was the daughter of an earl. Their second son, Robert Wardlaw Ramsay, born in 1816, was our Miss Ramsay's father. He was resigned to the fact that his older brother William would inherit the estate. So he planned to become an administrator for the East Indian Company. At that time, this behemoth of a company had its own training college in Haileybury. There, Robert studied useful languages and he received some academic awards. And at the completion of his studies at age 18, he begged his parents to allow him to do a grand tour of Europe and to spend some time with his brother William, who was already in Rome. They returned together, and then Robert set out for Calcutta, India, to join the civil service. In India, he was taken in by one of his mother's brothers in India, who unfortunately died a year later. Nonetheless, Robert was adapting to life in India. He bought 2 ponies so he could play polo in his off time. Then in 1836, his second year in India, he received 2 shocking letters. Now keep in mind, at this time it could take up to 6 months for letters to arrive from England. So even if they were not mailed simultaneously, they could arrive together. He read the first letter and learned of his brother's death, and then the next informed him of his father's death. Thus, at the age of 20, Robert Wardlaw Ramsay found himself suddenly thrust into the position of assuming the responsibilities of being the 8th Laird of Whitehill, which, as you can well imagine, was engulfed in chaos. 5 years later, in 1841, he married 22-year-old Lady Louisa Hay, a daughter of Field Marshal George Hay, mentioned previously. The young couple honeymooned around Italy for a couple of years. In their absence, construction of their new home, designed by a prominent architect, began. In 1844, they moved in and decorated it with paintings which they had collected during their time in Italy. Those were high times, and they lived in a grand style, with a butler, French maid, grooms and carriages. They had 10 surviving children, 9 girls and 1 boy. To celebrate the birth of a son, the village was invited to a party, with roasted meat, a brass band, and fireworks. Robert also generously built a Catholic church for his coal miners who were from northern Italy. To run the mines, he hired a mining engineer, and when the price of coal plummeted, the engineer cleverly bought him out. Over time, the Wardlaw Ramsays found themselves on the brink of bankruptcy, and drastic measures were taken. They rented out their home and spent a few years living in Paris. Here is a painting from Paris with our Miss Ramsay. She, along with her younger sister and her brother, who's holding the dog. The family also moved often, renting various homes around England. When their daughter Annie died at the age of 18, the family returned to Whitehill, and their father appears to have had a severe mental breakdown. This quote comes directly from the website I previously mentioned. Quote, Robert's mental state appears to have deteriorated, and family life, now back in Whitehill, was marred by his violence toward his children. Physical punishment was the norm, but the beatings that Robert inflicted on his son and daughters were not normal. The girls escaped by getting married or joining the missionary leagues. George joined the army and went to India. In 1878, a drastic step of selling the paintings was taken, and the old masters were sent to London to be auctioned. Another 61 paintings were auctioned from Whitehill, an event attended by all of Robert's friends and neighbors, unquote. This appears to have been a particularly humiliating event, as they gleefully sought to underbid each other for his paintings. Our Miss Ramsay was the 4th child. Her 2 remaining older sisters, with hardly a dowry and not having been presented socially, ended up marrying clergymen. One in particular married a clergyman who was a leader in the Church Missionary Society. This appears to have facilitated Miss Elizabeth Ramsay and her younger sister, Miss Mary Alice Ramsay's entry into the missionary service. To my great astonishment, the Ramsay Quest website actually has a photo of 5 of the Ramsay daughters together in the year 1878, the very same year as the art auction just mentioned. And there are 3 granddaughters on the same photo. We can't be 100% certain that Elizabeth, our Miss Ramsay, is among them, but on the accompanying note, she is deemed as the most likely person on the far left. Using computer software, we get this. Taking it further, we get this. And this. Our Miss Ramsay would have been about 30 in this photo. That's 12 years before she is mentioned as arriving in Jaffa in Palestine. What happened in those years? By all means, please share any information concerning Miss Ramsay that you might come across in the comments section. You might find these interesting. Here are some brief passages from the missionary newsletter I came across, which mention Miss Ramsay by name.
The CMS ladies at Jaffa. From Miss Armstrong. CMS, Jaffa, December 28, 1889. We had very happy Christmas Day, though it was pouring with rain nearly all the day. Tried to go to the morning service at the colony, but had to turn back, as could not hold up an umbrella and guide my donkey, but we had delightful United Arabic and English service at night. We had about 200 boys at our Scripture Reading Union Bible classes this morning. The class had of the younger boys grew so large that they could not all get into the room, so it has had to be divided and Miss Ramsay takes half of it. Miss Newton always has nice class of the elder boys. Is it not encouraging to have them coming to Bible class on their holiday? Doubt whether many English schoolboys would be found to do it willingly. We have new teacher for Arabic, and he keeps us up to the mark very well. Miss Ramsay is already making great progress. Can understand it fairly well now, and can use it little. Do beg of our friends in England to remember us in prayer about this. Think you have very little idea how difficult it is for some of us to go to school again. May 6, 1890. Now we have lost Miss Ramsay. She returned with Mrs. and Miss Lowe to Haifa, and since then we have sent her horse and man, so we hope to hear soon of her settling comfortably at Haifa. We feel very sorry to lose her. She and I rode to Abud about a month ago, and stayed the night. Wish we could often go, but it is 6 hours' ride from here. We took our 2 men, as one comes from there, so he knew the way. The first 3 hours is across the plain, and the last 3 all up the mountains, most steep and rocky. My horse did the journey splendidly, so was very little tired. We arrived at 2:30, and the crowd that gathered to look at us, at our native teacher's house, was most amusing. We were the first European ladies ever seen there. Of course they know Mr. Hall and Mr. Sykes, but no lady. After lunch, said, now we will have meeting, taking advantage of the crowd, 50 women and girls. We had such nice meeting for an hour, speaking in Arabic first, and then Miss Ramsay by interpretation. In the evening we rang the school bell and got several men, and had another meeting, about 13 in all. We then began to put up our camp beds, and the congregation insisted on watching. At last we suggested we should like to go to bed, and after some more questioning they retired. We could not sleep the whole night, so got up at 6. We had our meals outside in the yard where our horses stood. In the morning we had all the school children, a small school only, about 20, for Bible lesson. They seemed so bright and answered nicely. Our teacher there is a very nice man.
Once in Haifa with Mrs. and Miss Lowe and the large German Christian community of several hundred, Miss Ramsay decided to work across the bay in Akka. Definitely a more challenging undertaking. Here is another brief mention from the 1890 Church Missionary Gleaner. Quote, Miss E.C. Wardlaw Ramsay, who was at Jaffa, but has lately gone to Haifa, where Mrs. and Miss Lowe are already at work, proposes to go on to Akka. Unquote. According to the CMS, Miss Elizabeth C. Ramsay came to Palestine in 1889. Thus she served there for a bit more than 20 years. Her sister Alice left Africa in 1892 to serve in Palestine. This was 3 years after her sister arrived there. The note does not indicate exactly where she was. However, on the Ramsay Quest website, they mention that the Ramsay sisters were visited by their nephew, who was there with the British military. They mention it being during World War I, but that started in 1914, so that can't be correct, at least in connection to Miss Ramsay. Perhaps he was there prior to the war in a diplomatic or liaison capacity. I did, however, find an entry in the notes of the anthropologist Gertrude Bell from the year 1905, which mentions Miss Ramsay and the Ramsays in plural. Here's a snippet. Monday, the 24th, 1905. Went to see Miss Ramsay and found her just going out to dinner. Camped outside the gate, coldish. Tuesday, 25th, 1905. Breakfasted with the Ramsays. Walked around the town with Miss Ramsay. Lunched with the Ramsays and drove to Haifa in the streaming rain. She also notes that Miss Ramsay told her that she no longer teaches Abdu'l-Bahá's daughters English. Now we get to the anecdotes involving Miss Ramsay and Abdu'l-Bahá. These are from entries in the diary of Ahmad Sohrab, who accompanied Abdu'l-Bahá as an interpreter during his visit to Edinburgh, Scotland in 1913. Keep in mind, these are diary notes at the end of a long day. He writes in his own voice, but also quotes Abdu'l-Bahá, so it might be slightly confusing. Also, he mentions Miss Ramsay as being 70 years of age and leaving Akka after 40 years of service. Note that only around 20 plus years were in Palestine. Also, she was about 5 years younger than Abdu'l-Bahá, and that would have made her in her early 60s when she left Akka.
He spoke to us at the time about a Miss Ramsay from Scotland who was a most zealous missionary in Akka. She was not friendly to the cause, but the Master showed her all manner of kindness, because she was very faithful to her Christ. Miss Ramsay, do you know how much I love you? Look in your heart and see how much you hate me. To that extent I love you, the Master would tell her as she would try to turn her back upon him. She had the Bible in her hand, and from morning till evening she would go from house to house and read it to the people. For a long time she used to come to our house and read it to the members of his household. They listened to her every time most attentively. Finally she thought that now I have converted them. One day she was reading when one of the family asked her the meaning of the verse she had just read. She could not give it. They told the lady this is a prophecy about the appearance of Baha'u'llah. You see, it is so plain. She got very upset, and left the house. She was very charitable. She spent all her money in this work. She had 12 girls educated in the college in Beirut at her own expense, and often she gave money to the poor in Akka. For 40 years she labored very faithfully, and when she was 70 years old she said, I must return now to Scotland. I have grown too old to be useful. Abdu'l-Bahá said, I gave her a farewell banquet. I liked her very much. I would like to see her in Scotland. I will tell her, see, I have come to see you. Some years ago there lived in Akka a Scottish missionary who was working most earnestly to spread about her Christian religion. The results acquired, however, were negligible. Now, although this lady did not like us, I always on meeting her inquired after her health, so, one morning, as I was sitting in the bazaar with a Jewish Baha'i, I greeted her as she passed by. Then I said, do you see my companion? He was born a Jew and had no regard for the Christ, yet today he believes in him and loves him. Is this true? The missionary exclaimed, astonished. Then, may I be permitted to ask him a few questions? Certainly, I answered, you may ask him as many questions as you wish. Whereupon the lady turned to the Jew and inquired, do you look upon Jesus as your Lord? Yes, answered the man. And how did you come to do so? She pursued. Do you want scriptural proof or rational proof? Scriptural proof. Then, during nearly half an hour, the Jew spoke very eloquently, advancing quotation after quotation from the Old Testament to prove the validity of the claims of Jesus. Presently, he was asked for rational evidence, and this phase also he was able to treat with equal force and fluency. When the man had concluded, the missionary remained silent for a moment, then she said, this is indeed a most wonderful thing, a miracle, yet I am not satisfied. If only you had kept him at the fountain of the Christ, but instead, you have made him believe in Baha'u'llah and all the prophets. This missionary could not appreciate the fact that it was the words of Baha'u'llah that had made of the Jew a follower of Jesus.
Miss Ramsay after Akka. This will come as a surprise to many who have looked into the history of Miss Ramsay. Every genealogy site that I've seen, and even the Ramsay Quest website, shows her date of death as 1913 in Jaffa, Palestine. Well, I have some good news. Our Miss Ramsay did not pass away in 1913 in Palestine. She appears to have returned to the UK, but her desire to serve caused her to leave the UK for yet another adventure. In 1913, as Abdu'l-Bahá was visiting Scotland, Miss Ramsay departed England for Ceylon, which is now Sri Lanka. From the missionary history of Ceylon, we have this entry which clearly states that Miss Ramsay, who had been a missionary for many years in Palestine, came to stay with Miss Leslie Melville and worked as a volunteer at the girls' college. The next year, 1914, the principal resigned to marry, and our Miss Ramsay stepped in as acting principal. Then in September of 1916, Miss Ramsay, along with her friend Miss Melville, returned to England. Miss Melville took a job as principal, and I'd like to think that her friend Miss Ramsay was also there to lend a hand. My takeaway: Miss Ramsay's life was a wild ride, born of a privilege and suddenly thrust into the harsh reality of life with the sudden loss of status, hopes, and dreams. And she was of a class and age in which a woman in her situation didn't have many options. Yet, as an adult, she mastered Arabic and shared Christ's message of love and salvation in a foreign land in harsh conditions, basically alone and on her own. Here is a passage from a Baha'i who went on a pilgrimage to Akka and spent some time there. He encountered Miss Ramsay and had some very nice things to say about her.
An ardent Christian and most anxious to make converts. Thinking that I was a good prospect, she invited me to study with her, and I caught at this chance of learning the Bible and English too. I attended her school assiduously in the evenings, and while I was more interested in the language than in the Bible, I got a lot out of both. I owed this lady a great deal, and respected her love for Christianity, which had impelled her to uproot herself from home and take up residence in a strange land. It was a good experience and very useful to me.
There's no doubt that she had an impact on many lives. For me, it's wonderful to know that Abdu'l-Bahá honored her with a banquet when she left Palestine, and to know how much he admired her faith and service, despite her misgivings about him. And from her perspective, there was a pressure to report converts, and it must have been very frustrating for her to see the stream of seekers, rich and poor, high and low, from all corners of the earth who flocked to see Abdu'l-Bahá. For my part, I'd like to think that in the spiritual realm, Miss Ramsay and Abdu'l-Bahá finally had a glorious reunion. Your actions do actually have quite an impact, even if you don't know it. And think about this. If you like videos and then actually like them on YouTube, it helps other people to find them. So flap your butterfly wings and please like this video.